All right, good evening, everybody. I know I'm running a few minutes late tonight, but I do apologize for that. But welcome to the Eupora Church of Christ, our Tuesday night Bible study that we've been doing here on the book of Daniel. This week, we're going to be continuing on in that study this week now in chapter 8. I hope you've enjoyed the study so far. I hope it's been something that you found beneficial. My running joke right now is I dare not say it's been a fruitful study because my wife says I've been using that too much. So now I just make mention of it really just to irritate her. If you have your Bible, go ahead and turn with me to Daniel chapter 8. We're going to look at another vision that Daniel has. Daniel, again, still an old man now. We're going to notice a couple of things in this chapter, chapter 8. Again, very similar to chapter 7. That's quite oftenly taken out of context, and it's construed to mean things that it really doesn't mean, and you'll see as we get more into that. It's kind of hard to just throw that out there. So I will say this, and I've heard this illustration before, and it's fitting for this chapter. It's fitting for the book of Daniel in general, really, that if you look at the study of Daniel, a lot of times we study it for the stories, and it's an interesting study. But you get into the prophetic sense, and you get into these later chapters that we're in now. I've heard it described as like climbing a mountain, and there are parts, as we're going to see tonight, that it gets steep. It gets very steep, and it's sometimes a little bit harder to grasp than it is. But the important part is what is the context, and understand what is the language, that it's an apocalyptic writing, and it's keeping some of this in context. And if you can do that, then it's really not as hard as we like to make it out to be. So if you have your Bible and you're on Daniel chapter 8, let's go ahead and pick up in the first verse. I want to notice the first few verses kind of one at a time, and I want to mention some points, specifically because of the contention around these verses, if you will. Daniel chapter 8, verse 1. In the third year of the reign of King Belshazzar, a vision appeared to me, Daniel, after the one that appeared to me the first time. Now, if you remember our timeline, I talked about this some last week. We're all out of whack, aren't we? If you're trying to figure out, you're like, now hang on a second. If I go back to Daniel chapter 5, that was the last year of Belshazzar's reign. Last chapter, we looked at the first year of Belshazzar. So the point there is these are not in chronological order. In fact, if we were going to go through chronological order, we would have had to have gone up to chapter 4, then jumped to chapter 7 and chapter 8, and then backed up to 5 and 6, at which point we start transitioning from Babylonian rule into Persian rule, and then so on from there. So when you read this and you read the third year, it's like, man, where are we in the context here? Like, where are we in the time frame? Well, understand at this point, this is still Babylonian rule, even though the power has already been pulled from Babylon. Following Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon was already on the descent. And so now we're back with King Belshazzar, of course, who is the son of Nabonidus, who's the actual king. Belshazzar is the second king. If you remember, he was going to offer Daniel the third highest seat because that was the highest that he could offer him at that point in time. So that's kind of where we are. We're still backing up now to before we got into chapter 5. So if we were going to go in chronological order, next week we would start in chapter 5, which is the last year of Belshazzar's reign. So in verse 2, I saw in this vision, and it so happened while I was looking that I was in Shushan, the citadel, which is in the province of Elam, and I saw in the vision that I was by the river Ulai. Now, critics of the book of Daniel will use this verse as a point of contention. And you might think, well, what's contentious about verse number 2? I really didn't read anything here that would read to me as contentious or as a point of conflict or anything. Well, what some of the critics will point out is at the time that Daniel is writing, Shushan has not been constructed yet. So therefore, how could Daniel have been in Shushan? Yet my question is Daniel actually there? Or is this something that he has seen in a vision, which is what we're told? That's what he said. While I was looking, well, what was he looking in? He was looking in this vision. So again, keep in mind what I've already mentioned before, apocalyptic language, using this these descriptive terms as we are. He says, I'm seeing this in a vision. This is what I'm seeing. And then they try to make it literal. Well, he was in Shushan. No, he was seeing that in a vision. So then go down to the next verse, verse 3. Daniel says, Then I lifted my eyes, and I saw, and there standing beside the river was a ram. This ram had 2 horns, and the 2 horns were high, but one was higher than the other, and the higher one came up last. Now, if you're someone that really enjoys imagery, this is probably your book. Am I right? Remember that the last few chapters that we have covered, especially if you go back to chapter 7 last week, and the whole chapter was on the 4 beasts and a little horn that came up from there. I don't want you to hear little horn and get confused. This is a different little horn we're going to look at tonight. We're going to get to that. I don't want you to start getting confused on that if you are. But there's a lot of imagery in here as to what these means. Well, last week it was all about these beasts. Go back to chapter 2, it was all about this statue. Now we're in chapter 8, and we're going to see more beasts. Chapter 8, we're going to see more beasts. But fortunately for us, we do not have to try to understand or try to comprehend or imagine what these beasts represent, because what we're going to see later on in chapter 8 of Daniel is that we're going to be told what these beasts represent. We're going to be told what they mean. We don't have to imagine. So we know exactly who this ram with 2 horns is going to represent, but I kind of want you to embark on this journey with me, if you will, and just think about it. Think about what we've talked about in previous chapters. So if we're going to talk about a nation that would be represented by 2 horns, 2 parts of a different country, what is that going to mean to you, especially if you remember back to what we've talked about in the beast last chapter and the statue in chapter 2? Well, who would this ram then represent with 2 parts? Well, we know that's the Medes and the Persians. The same group in chapter 2 of Daniel, represented by the breast and the arms of silver, the bear in Daniel chapter 7 that had the 3 ribs in its mouth. And it says one horn was larger than the other. What history tells us that, we've already talked about this in the previous chapters, that the Persians were greater than their counterparts, the Medes. So the greater horn, of course, is representative of Persia, and then the smaller horn there of the Medes. But let's notice what's happening with this ram. Verse 4 says, I saw the ram pushing westward, northward, and southward, so that no animal could withstand him, nor was there any that could deliver from his hand. But he did according to his will and became great. So I mentioned it already just now, but when we talked about the bear last week, we talked about the 3 ribs in its mouth. And these represented the 3 great, I don't want to say the 3 great, they had a lot of conquests, but 3 great conquests of this empire. And last week I even mentioned the directions. And if you remember what verse 4 we just read says, the ram was pushing westward, northward, and southward. Well, last week we talked about 3 conquests: Babylon to the west, Lydia to the north, and Egypt to the south. So all of these are tying into what history already tells us has happened here. And it's just, I find this so fascinating. And I know I say this, I've said this before when it comes to the study on Daniel, but we're seeing all of this before it takes place. And that's prophetic language, right? It's telling us what's going to happen. But we're seeing these things hundreds of years before they're taking place. Not necessarily hundreds of years with the Medes and Persians conquering Babylon. This is coming pretty soon. But, the text we're going to look at with Alexander the Great and all these things here in just a little bit, these are a couple hundred years down the road. And they're being told to this level of accuracy. Well, of course they are, because we know they're inspired. But this was a powerful nation here, representative of this ram, the 2 big horns there. And no one could stand against this nation. This nation could basically have its way if we want. That's kind of what it's telling us, that no one could stand against this great nation, right? Until somebody was able to. And we can just go to the next verse, and we're already going to see this. Verse 5, Daniel said, and as I was considering, suddenly a male goat came from the west across the surface of the whole earth, without touching the ground. We're going to come back to that. And the goat had a notable horn between his eyes. There's a lot of talk of horns tonight, you're going to notice. So who will stand against this mighty ram? You know, who's going to take on this mighty ram? Well, it's going to be a goat. So I love the language here. I get kind of a kick out of that, the way this is described. But you think about this mighty ram with two horns, and here comes a goat. And the goat is going to stand up against. But, of course, the goat is representative. So we're told later on the meaning of this goat, but likely we know it enough already because we've been studying this. We've been talking about this. And this is now the third time we're seeing the breakdown in these nations. The third time. So who followed the Medes and the Persians in the image of Nebuchadnezzar in chapter 2 and the beast of Daniel chapter 7? Well, we know that the next one to follow that is then going to conquer the ram or the Medes and the Persians is the Grecians. So we know that. We know that's who's coming. And, of course, we're going to be told later on in this chapter, but we don't really have to wait until then because we already understand this from the study. But what do you make of the mention of that phrase? I said we're going to come back to it, without touching the ground. Because here's a goat. Let's be honest, a goat is probably not the most graceful animal you're going to think of. If you're going to think of grace, goat's probably not high up on the list, right? But here's this goat that's going without touching the ground. Now, when you think about Greece and you think about the first king here that's in focus, and we've already talked about Alexander the Great in depth last week, and we're going to talk about Alexander the Great more in depth tonight because it's part of the study. But what's often mentioned about the Grecian Empire and about Alexander the Great in general? Well, it was the speed and the swiftness in which he conquered these lands, and he was able to do all these things that he was able to do. So here's this goat in focus, this goat that's going to take on the ram, and it's not even touching the ground. It's going that fast, it's going that hard, it's not even touching the ground. And so that's the focus here, at the speed at which Alexander conquered the known world at that time, all the way to the gates of India at lightning pace. I mean, barely over 10 years, he's able to do all of these things. And we remember that in the last chapter, in chapter 7, well, how was Greece, and specifically Alexander the Great, represented when we talked about these beasts? Well, it was a leopard, which is already a stealthy animal. It had 4 wings with a swiftness. Now we're talking about a goat whose feet is not even touching the ground. So what does our goat here, and again, I kind of smile every time I think about that. What does our goat here do to this mighty ram with 2 horns and the one horn that's bigger than the other? Well, let's notice the next couple of verses. Then he came to the ram that had 2 horns, which I had seen standing beside the river, and ran at him with furious power. Ran at him with furious power. Verse 7 says, and I saw him confronting the ram. He was moved with rage against him, and he attacked the ram, and he broke his 2 horns. There was no power in the ram to withstand him, but he cast him down to the ground, and he trampled him. And there was no one that could deliver the ram from his hand. So here's our goat. And again, I promise you I'm going to stop chuckling every time I say goat here soon. I don't know when, but sooner I will. The goat here conquers the ram. The Grecians conquer the Medo-Persians. They're going to conquer the Medo-Persians because we're reading about this vision and it's like it's happening. Of course, it's prophetic language. It hasn't happened yet. This is still a couple hundred years down the road, especially at this point with the goat conquering the rams, the Grecians conquering the Persians. But then the goat is going to cast down this ram and trample on them so that the entire empire is desolated. Now, this is such clear prophecy. And I want you to see this because, again, this is just something I find so fascinating about this book. This is such clear prophecy that there's no wonder that even Alexander the Great knew this was about him when he was being shown this. You say, well, now hang on. What do you mean that Alexander the Great thought this was about him? Well, Alexander the Great is going to end up in Jerusalem, and he's going to be shown the writing of Daniel here. He is going to be shown what Daniel wrote. And even he can recognize that this is about him. Now, Josephus, and depending on how you feel about Josephus writes about this in his book, The Antiquities of the Jews. And this is in part why I find this so fascinating, that in strolls Alexander the Great, a person that when he came to town, you were going to exalt this guy. You're going to, this is Alexander the Great. My goodness, my head just blew. In strolls him, and what does he do? But he sees this. He's not going to destroy the temple. That's also not to say that he's going to praise God, because he's not going to do that. But he's not going to destroy the temple, and he's going to actually show a level of respect. So they show him the book. He takes it correctly to mean himself, and that's what we're going to see later on when we get further down into the chapter. This is 200 years prior, give or take, 200 plus or minus years prior to this point. That is incredible accuracy of these events. You go, well, that's incredible. No, that's prophetic. This is an inspired writing. So we say, well, this is a book written by men. Well, no, this is a book inspired by God that is telling you exactly what's going to take place 200 years from the time Daniel writes. Is still in Babylon. They haven't even been defeated yet. We're already 2 conquests down the road. And Alexander the Great is going to see this, and he's going to know that it's about him. And I just find that fascinating. So let's keep moving. I'll end up staying on this verse for a long time. Let's keep moving. Verse 8 says, therefore the male goat grew very great. Male goat, Greece, Alexander the Great. But when he became strong, now here's our king. When he became strong, the large horn was broken. And in its place, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. Now, we talked about this some last week already. At the height of his power, and at the young age of almost 33 years old, Alexander the Great is going to die. Now, there's a lot of discussion back and forth on exactly how Alexander the Great died. But we know that it was at the height of his power. His empire, his conquests are so vast and so great. He's conquered the known world, gone to places of the earth that no one else had gone, and faster than anybody else had gone. But when he became strong, the large horn was broken, and in his place, 4 notable ones came up toward the 4 winds of heaven. And again, we mentioned this point also, that once Alexander dies, his 4 generals are then going to divide his land, because there wasn't a rightful heir to the throne, that at least wasn't being challenged. So the 4 are going to divide the land. So Greece goes from one powerful king, swift-moving leopard with 4 wings. That's how this nation, that's how this king is described, the big horn of this goat, to 4. But now we're about to get to the interesting part, at least in my personal opinion, of this chapter. Verse 9 and following, because now we're about to see another little horn. We're about to see another little horn. Now, if you remember last week in chapter 7, there was also a little horn. But now the little horn of chapter 7 came from the Roman Empire. It came from the 4th empire, which is the Roman Empire. And I mentioned that there's a lot of discussion about who exactly the horn is, that there's those that are trying to make the horn of the Roman Empire the Antichrist and all this stuff. But my personal thoughts coming from studying the book of Revelations is Domitian, because you got to keep it in context. What is the context of the book, right? And so those that are trying to make it the Antichrist and in the final days and all, well, again, they're completely pulling out of context what it says. Because when you get to final days, well, that's the final days and time stops. But in chapter 7, time didn't stop. And we had all these things happen. And what do we see? Time kept going after these events. So it's hard to keep trying to make this fit something that it doesn't fit, because it doesn't fit. Not that hard to really figure out. So now we're going to see another little horn. This is not the same horn from the past chapter. As I said, past one was from the Roman Empire. Here, we are in now the divided Grecian Empire. And we're about to see another horn come up. So let's just notice verse 9 real fast. And out of one of them, so this is the 4 divided, the divided sections of the Grecian Empire. And out of one of them came a little horn which grew exceedingly great toward the south, towards the east, and towards the glorious land. Again, not the same little horn, but most scholars at least are in agreement. Now you go back to chapter 7, a lot of disagreement, a lot of thought on who this horn is of chapter 7. Chapter 8, there's actually quite a bit of agreement as to whom this horn represents. That there was a man that came up, and history points to this, called Antiochus Epiphanes. This is a very evil person, as we're about to read, and describe some of the things that he did. But he is going to take over for his brother, Seleucid, who is the ruler of one of the provinces of the divided kingdom of Alexander the Great. And so he is now going to take over. And I find it interesting that Antiochus Epiphanes, he gives himself that connotation, the Epiphanes. That means the illustrious one. And he gives himself that. But the Israelites, and their, I guess, form of satire, or their form of kind of getting a dig in at him, they would often refer to him as Antiochus Epimanes, not Epiphanes. Epiphanes means illustrious one. Epimanes, it's a tongue twister to keep saying those, means madman. And that's a very fitting title for someone when you can read the historical accounts of Antiochus Epiphanes. A madman is a fantastic way to describe someone this crazy and out there. But there are a couple of points before we get into the next few verses that I really want you to understand and take away from this, because some of it's hard to understand, some of it's hard to comprehend, but there's an important takeaway from this, especially in these remaining verses. First off, I want you to understand that God allows this to happen to Israel. And we're going to read it, and you're going to naturally ask yourself this question: well, why would God allow this to happen to Israel? Well, we're going to be told, as punishment for their sinful rebellion against God. So because of that, God allows this to take place. Secondly, I want you to notice that this is going to be a limited, controlled punishment. But understand the severity of the punishment that they are about to face. They've not faced anything like this before. Nothing like this before. To this extent of the evilness of Antiochus Epiphanes. So this evil man is outraged against Judaism, against God worship, and he is going to do everything in his power to stop it. You see, because he's going to get his hand slapped, if you will. He's the ruler now of this part of the Grecian Empire. He keeps branching out. Again, historical context supports this, and he actually is tried to conquer Egypt now a few times. He can't do it. The Romans intervene, and they basically kick him out. They're like, you're not gonna do anything here. They draw a circle around him and basically say, you're not going to go any further. And he doesn't. So instead, on his way back, now he's upset. Now he's frustrated. He's going to take a lot of this out on the Jews and on Judaism in general. And we're going to see some of that. So notice verses 10 and 11. And we'll break them down kind of a couple at a time here, just for time's sake. So 10 and 11 says, and it grew up, little horn, grew up to the host of heaven. And it cast down some of the host and some of the stars to the ground, and it trampled them. He even exalted himself as the prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away, and the place of his sanctuary was cast down. Make no mistake, with Antiochus Epiphanes, whom the war was with. Antiochus was against God. I'm going to get to this here in a little bit, probably just in the next verse. This is a Grecian man. We've talked about the Hellenistic Jews and all this in the book of Acts. When you go back to the Grecian pagan culture and the Hellenistic culture that they had, this was their mindset. This is what they were. So Antiochus Epiphanes, he is against God altogether. He's against God worship. And we're going to get into some of the things he did in the next verse against the Jews, against Judaism, against God worship in general. And it is horrible, to be completely honest with you, the things that he does to God's people. But you have to understand, And this is the tough part, if you will, to have to understand this point, was when you read through some of the stuff that we're going to look at, you go, well, why in the world would something like this happen? Why would God allow something like this to happen? And it'd be a good question, but I already told you, the passage tells us it was punishment for their rebellion against God. And we say, well, God is a God of love. God wouldn't do something like it. Well, understand, God is a God of love, but God is a just God. God is a just God. So God is going to allow this to happen. So notice what verse 12 says. Because of transgression. Because of transgression. So what causes? Because of transgression, an army was given over to the horn to oppose the daily sacrifices that the Jews would offer to God, and cast truth down to the ground. He did all this, and he prospered. So two things there. I'm going to come back to these in just a moment. But two big things we find out here in this verse. One, the horn opposed daily sacrifice. No more sacrifices. And in fact, he is going to, what's the word I want to use? He's going to diminish the importance of the sacrifice. He's going to, I can't come up with the word I'm looking for. He is going to, we'll get to it in a second. Maybe I can get the word I'm looking for here. But what he's going to do to the altar of God, you'll see in just a moment. And he's going to do all this against God. And God is going to allow this as punishment for his people, because if you remember, this is not the first time that God has used a pagan nation such as this to exercise judgment on his people. And we're told here it's because of transgression. And in fact, you can read the book of Malachi, and the book of Malachi is going to tell you a lot of the same things, that it was against the priesthood that had done some of this stuff. So I mentioned already that Antiochus, he was a Grecian ruler. He's going to be looking to Hellenize these people, or Grecianize their mindset in their worship. And if you're a Grecian leader, then you worship a certain god, wouldn't you? Little g God, Zeus. Not the God, not the living and holy God. You're worshiping Zeus and some pagan gods, and one of any dozen gods if you're a Grecian. So he comes into Jerusalem, and Onias was the current high priest at that time in Jerusalem. Antiochus is going to replace Onias with his brother Jason. And all this is very underhanded. It's very deceitful on what happens here with Antiochus and Jason. Jason, the brother of Onias, who is the high priest, he's going to strike a plan with Antiochus to betray his brothers, to help in the plan of Antiochus of basically destroying God worship, which none of it sound like a very good high priest. And we could easily blend this right back into our study of the book of Hebrews on Sunday mornings. But Onias is going to be murdered, and his brother is going to take over as high priest. And we talk about all these evil things. And I want you to notice that, well, how can we be sure this is Antiochus Epiphanes? I want you to notice some of the things mentioned, that what we just read is some of the things that Antiochus Epiphanes actually did. And you decide, like I said, the commentators, the writers on this stuff, they're all pretty well, I don't want to say everyone, but majority are in an agreement on this as far as to whom it is represented here. And you decide for yourself. That's the best thing you can do anyways, is you read it and you decide, well, who is in focus here? Well, remember what this verse just said. He opposed the daily sacrifice. He cast truth to the ground, and much more than that. Notice some of the things that Antiochus Epiphanes did. All Jewish law had to be stopped, and the writings, therefore, that correlate and associated with Jewish law, they were to be destroyed. He took the altar of God, of which these sacrifices would be made on, and he would offer pigs and swine to pagan gods. He would deface the altars of God. That's the word I was trying to come up with and couldn't get it. He would deface the altar of God. He took the feast that were made to God, the feast of celebrations to God, and they were made to be feast of pagans. But that wasn't it. Women, one of the accounts, you can talk about any of the 100,000 plus that would be killed and executed at this time. But women, this is one that it stuck out with me since I read this. Women who had their sons circumcised in accordance with God's covenant, that was what you had to do with your kids, they would be killed. Because this guy, this crazy guy, is trying to stop any God worship. So they would be killed. The babies would be killed. It'd be hung around them. At least 100,000 would be cast down, trampled on, and killed because they wouldn't turn away from God worship. Now you go back and you reread this verse. Verse 11 and verse 12. He exalted himself as the high prince of the host, and by him the daily sacrifices were taken away. Not only were they taken away, they were now changed to pagan worship. His sanctuary was cast down because he raided the temple. Because of transgressions, an army was given over to oppose the daily sacrifices. You couldn't worship God in any function, and he cast the truth down to the ground. All Jewish law was stopped. The writings were cast away. So it's pretty clear as to whom this is referencing. And this is talking about a certain period of time that we're going to get to here in just a moment. So let's keep reading. Verse 13 and verse 14, then I heard a holy one speaking. And another holy one said to that certain one who was speaking, how long would the vision be concerning the daily sacrifices and the transgression of desolation? We're going to get back to that phrase in a minute, transgression of desolation. The giving of both the sanctuary and the host to be trampled underfoot. And he said to me, for 2,300 days, and the sanctuary shall be cleansed. Excuse me. These antics by this man against the worship of the holy God are going to ultimately lead to a rebellion by the Jewish people. Maybe you've heard of this group, maybe you've not, but you likely have heard of the Maccabees and the Maccabean revolt. Now, there are books that are written that cover this period called the First and Second Maccabees. Now, these are not inspired books, or that'd be in our Bible if they were. But these are good, interesting, and historical purposes for this time period. This Maccabean revolt, this Jewish group, and it's started and head up by the Maccabees themselves. But this Maccabean revolt ultimately led to a war and an overthrowing of Antiochus Epiphanes. Not only that, it's going to lead to the cleansing and the reconsecration of the temple to God. So, they had the celebrations that they would keep, the Feast of Tabernacles, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. They had the feast that they would keep, and they actually added another feast because of this event right here. And it's a feast I'm sure you've heard of before, but it's actually called the Festival of Lights. And you'll hear that often referred to in a different sense of Hanukkah. So the time frame here is an interesting one, mentioning that thousands of days. And I said I'd get back to that. And if you do the math and you divide that out to years, that is a little short of 7 years. Now, if you remember 7 in the Bible, anytime you see the number 7, what does that mean? What does the number 7 represent? 7 represents completeness. On the seventh day, God rested from the creation. Our week is 7 days. The 7 days is complete. But when you do the math, this falls short of 7 days. This is 6 years and some 3 months. I have to figure it up again. I've done it before. But it falls short of 7 years. You remember that it was 7 years that Nebuchadnezzar was punished in Daniel chapter 4. It was 7 years of famine under Ahab. But this is not a full divine judgment against Israel. And instead, it stopped short of 7 years. It comes up short. So let's notice a few more verses. I kind of got a little behind on my time frame. Verse 15 and following says, then it happened when I, Daniel, had seen the vision and was seeking the meaning, that suddenly there stood before me one having the appearance of a man. And I heard a man's voice between the banks of the Uli, who called and said, Gabriel, make this man understand the vision. Now that right there is interesting in my opinion, because who is Gabriel? We know who Gabriel is. Gabriel is one of the 2 archangels that we have listed out, Gabriel and Michael. So now Gabriel is here, and he's going to help make clear this vision to Daniel. So here's Gabriel. So he came near where I stood. And when he came, I was afraid and I fell on my face. I would say so. Well, how would you respond to Gabriel being before you? He fell on his face. He was afraid. But he said to me, understand, Son of Man, that this vision refers to the time of the end. Now, as he was speaking with me, I was in a deep sleep with my face to the ground, but he touched me and he stood me upright. And he said, look, I'm making known to you what shall happen in the latter time of the indignation. For at the appointed time, the end shall be. Well, the end of what exactly? So I wanted to get to verse 19 for this specific purpose. The end of what? Because that's the question. That's the dispute when you get into this. The end of what? What happens here? Well, if you go to the premillennialist view, well, this is the end time. This is the coming of the millennial kingdom. That's what this means. That's clearly what's in focus here, right? Well, the AD 70 folks are going to say, well, this is the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. That's what this means. It's the end time, the destruction of the temple. But what is the context here? What have we been talking about? This entire chapter, what have we been talking about so far? Well, God's judgment, or God's punishment and judgment, I guess you could say, of both, on his people in Jerusalem. And he's doing this at the hands of this little horn, likely Antiochus Epiphanes. So that is our focus. But now you're saying, well, now we're jumping to the millennial kingdom now. Well, we're talking about this time of indignation, this time of punishment, this time that they are facing. Well, this time is going to end. There is a time coming where this is going to end. And we already talked about the Maccabean revolt here, that time did come. Not only that, in swift justice, as we're going to see, you have the Maccabean revolt, these Jewish God-fearing people of whom Antiochus wanted to destroy, wanted to completely remove and annihilate from the earth. He is going to die seeing them return to power. So sweet justice there. So he's talking about this time, that this indignation period here, this time of suffering, this time of all of this is going on, is going to end. This is not talking about the end time of the world. This is talking about a time coming at which point this indignation period is going to quit. It's important to keep this in context of what we are discussing here. So this time period, this suffering of the suffering of the Israelites is going to come to an end. Then verse 20, so now, Gabriel, I told you we don't have to guess as to what this vision means. The now second vision of Daniel, we don't have to try to figure it out on our own, because he is going to explain it to us. It says, the ram which you saw, verse 20 and following, having two horns, they are the kings of the Medes and the Persians. Well, we said that already. We haven't even read this, and we were able to get to that point. How? Because we've already read it twice in the Bible. And the male goat is the kingdom of Greece. The large horn that is between its eyes is the first king, Alexander the Great. As for the broken horn and the four that stood in its place, 4 kingdoms shall arise out of that nation, but not with its power. Well, Alexander the Great was the powerful. He's going to die, and from it, 4 kingdoms or 4 nations or powers are going to arise, but they don't have his individual power. In a later time of the kingdom, when the transgressors have reached their fullness, a king shall arise, having fierce features, who understands sinister schemes. His power shall be mighty, but not by his own power. He shall destroy fearfully, and shall prosper and thrive. He shall destroy the mighty, and also the holy people. Through his cunning, he shall cause deceit to prosper under his rule, and he shall exalt himself in his heart. He shall destroy many in their prosperity. He shall even rise against the prince of princes, but he shall be broken without human means. So hear that part again. Hear verse 25 one more time. Through his cunning, This is the little horn. And as I've said, this is presumably Antiochus Epiphanes. This is this little horn. Through his cunning, he shall cause deceit to prosper. He shall exalt himself in his own heart. He shall destroy many, more than 100,000 associated with being put to death because of him. He shall even rise against the prince of princes. He's going to even try to rise against God, God's people. He's going to try to do all this, but he shall be broken without human means. And as I told you, the swift justice is he is going to die seeing Jerusalem being restored. So swift justice there. And the vision of the evenings and mornings which was told is true. Therefore, seal up the vision, for it refers to many days in the future, many days indeed. Actually, a couple centuries down the road before this is going to happen. And I, Daniel, I love verse 27. And I, Daniel, fainted and was sick for days. Afterwards, what'd you do after that, Daniel? You got this vision. You're an old man now. You're in your 60s. You got this vision. You're sick from it. It's caused you a lot of turmoil inside. What are you going to do after that? Well, I arose and went about the king's business. I got up and I went back to work. And I was astonished by the vision, but no one understood it. Well, no, because it was hundreds of years before it happened. So if you're not clear on this, if you've never heard of the Maccabean revolt or any of this stuff, these events took place in what's commonly referred to as the quiet period, the dark period, the intertestament period between the Old Testament and the New Testament of the Bible. Yet it's anything but quiet, because Daniel has already written about it hundreds of years before it happened. Daniel's already told us exactly what's going to happen hundreds of years before it happened. In fact, the quiet period was anything but. Alexander the Great read this, and he knew what it meant. That all these nations are going to rise, but we don't ever lose sight of the important part of that. That these great nations are going to rise, but guess what's going to happen? We're going to get into the New Testament period. Something is going to happen that was told all the way back in the first vision of Daniel. That a stone would be cut out without hands, and all of these nations would be made to stand a pile heap. That's what's coming for them. And it was clear enough that Alexander could take that vision and say, yeah, that is me. We could get to the point here without even having to get to the end. Now, Gabriel tells him and explains his vision to him, and it reiterates to us what we were able to already decipher from being taught before what this means. And we can see that these nations are going to rise one after another, and God will use these nations in the judgment exercised upon his people, but it's not a complete judgment. So those that take Daniel chapter 8 and say, well, this is end times, this is the final end time. Well, this is talking about a time of indignation. This is talking about a time when someone, this little horn, like I keep saying, Antiochus Epiphanes, maybe not, whomever this little horn is, right? I told you most people agree on that, but that point doesn't really matter. It's someone coming from this Grecian Empire, from our third empire, not unlike the one from the last chapter, which came from the Roman Empire. They're going to have their time. They're going to be mighty, and they shall destroy. But he shall, end of verse 25 is one of my favorite parts. He shall be broken without human means. He was allowed to exercise this punishment on God's people for a controlled point. And then God said, nope, that's enough. We're done. Here it is. Shall be broken without human means. And then I read verse 27. So not to make light of a situation. It's just some of these words are funny, right? You hear Greece referred to as a goat. Who's going to stop the mighty ram? And then in strolls a goat. And I find that funny. And you look at Daniel and you say, well, and I, Daniel, in verse 27, I fainted and was sick for days. Yeah, I'd say so. I probably would have been too. We all likely would have. And you say, I hit the ground as if I was asleep. Yeah, we likely would have too if we were standing before Gabriel. Afterwards, I rose and I went about the king's business. So now we tie this all the way back into where we started. That he is still in Babylon. He's still doing the king's business. and he was seeing this vision, now his second vision. So that is Daniel chapter 8. I hope you guys have enjoyed the study. I hope it's been a study you've been able to take something away from. If you have any questions or comments on Daniel chapter 8, please make sure you're getting them on the Facebook page. I will go in and take a look at them and reply to the best of my abilities. If you'd like to study more, I'd be more than happy to do that with you also. If not, I hope you have a good rest of your night. Hope you have a good rest of your week. We'll be back tomorrow night on our Wednesday night Bible study for the Eupora Church of Christ. We'll be on in Ephesians chapter 5 starting tomorrow night. So make plans to be with us if you can. It's going to be a good study. I've enjoyed both this study in the book of Daniel and the book of Ephesians. Both very good books. Daniel is a very, very interesting book, and you can see why, right? I keep trying to come back to the point of context because it's so often taken out of context. So that's really the focus there. What does it mean, and what was the purpose of it being written? And every time you see one word pop up, oh, that's end time. That's end. What's the context of it? So I hope y'all have a good rest of your night. I look forward to studying with you in the book of Ephesians tomorrow night. Thank you all for your time and your attention. Have a good night, and God bless.